Welcome to Organizational Stress and Wellbeing Interventions. We're glad you're here. My name is Angie Hunt, Project Manager with the Canadian Institute for the Relief of Pain and Disability, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. This webinar is made possible through the support of the Community Gaming Grant Program through the BC Government, as well as donations and memberships to CIRPD. While we're waiting for others to join us, I'll go over a few technical points for the webinar. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers or through the conference call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box to submit any issues you may be experiencing and to ask any questions you have related to the presentation. We'll collect questions submitted throughout the presentation and follow the presentation with Q&A based on the questions submitted. Following the webinar, any questions not answered in the allotted time will be answered and distributed after the event. The presentation will be recorded and posted for free on our website within a week, along with the slides. You'll be emailed the direct links for all these items when they are available. As I mentioned, my name is Angie, and I'll be moderating the webinar and Q&A session. Our presenter today is Dr. Caroline Biron. Dr. Biron is an Associate Professor of Occupational Health and Safety Management at Laval University, Quebec, Canada. She earned a master's degree in psychology from Laval University and a PhD from Lancaster University Management School in the United Kingdom. She is actively involved in several organizations to support and evaluate implementation of interventions to reduce stress, improve well-being, and organizational performance. And now I'll turn it over to Caroline.
Thank you. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I will be presenting to you a research project that we have conducted and has recently been published. I do hope you'll be able to find something useful, whether you're a researcher, a practitioner, an employee, a manager. I hope there is something in it that you might be using for your own work. We had a whole research team that was involved. So here are the colleagues that participated in this research project that was conducted over 2 years. And here's the context of the study. The idea came from a previous intervention we conducted where I had a manager who just was in the middle of a big, complex intervention. And she said, we started by implementing the easy actions. It was the sugar pie. But managing psychosocial risks is the broccoli in the plate. And this was kind of the start of the study. We did some previous interventions, and recently a book was published by my colleague Maria Karonika-Murray in the UK and myself, and we kind of reflected upon what makes the intervention work and how does it work. And we thought it pretty much looks like a martini glass. Nothing to do with my love for the drink, but let's see the component we have in it. Some of your intervention is going to be related, obviously, to its actual content, the activities you're going to put in place to prevent stress and improve well-being. So the actual content of your activities. But there's a big part of whether it's going to work or not that's going to be related to the process. So how you're going to be doing things, so how you're going to prepare, how you're going to conduct your risk assessment or your diagnostic, how you're going to be planning, implementing, and evaluating your intervention. And the third olive, let's call it this way, in your martini glass, is the actual context of your intervention. So the organizational context, for example, if there is some downsizing going on or some organizational changes or people leaving, coming in, etc. And also the context of the actual intervention that you're doing. Sometimes the champion of the intervention, the one who's responsible for it, is going to switch job or leave for whatever reason. So there's all kinds of interruptions in your intervention, and it will influence the actual result. So all of this to say that we're not just interested in whether the intervention is working, we're interested in how it actually works. And that's been quite a black box over the years in the intervention literature. And this is where this project is going to be situated. Now, a little word about the content of our interventions. What should we be focusing on in terms of organizational stress and well-being interventions? Well, there's a strong empirical support showing that psychosocial constraints at work are related to a wide range of individual and organizational indicators, both related to health and performance. So higher absenteeism, higher risks of coronary heart disease, a higher risk of mental health problems such as depression. There's also lower satisfaction at work. There's a huge amount of studies that have been conducted over the years in all sorts of occupational sectors and with different populations, and there's pretty strong support for these psychosocial constraints. And I did put a few references there, but there's a lot more. We've got about 3 decades of research on this. These 4 social constraints, just in case you're not familiar with this literature, I'll have a brief introduction to this. We're mainly talking here about 4 psychosocial constraints in the work environment. One of them is low job control. We know that having low job control is bad for you. It's bad for your health. So if you're not able to make some decisions about your work, if you cannot use your skills and be creative, it's a factor that is increasing your risks of having a mental health problem, especially if it's combined with high job demands, having too much work to do, having to go very fast, working really hard mentally with interruptions and conflicting requests. So having high job demands can be something that is potentially negative, but it could even be more negative and more risky if you have a low job control with it. Another factor is the low recognition. We're all involved in putting a lot of effort into our work, but in exchange, we're expecting to be recognized for the work we do, not just by having an adequate salary, but also by having some respect, esteem from colleagues, from superiors, from the people we work with. So it goes beyond just having a well-paid job. So we're also expecting to be promoted within that job, or to have access to, for example, interesting tasks and promotion prospects, and also to have a permanent position. If you're scared you're going to be losing your job, it's difficult for you to really engage in it. And the 4th constraint is social support. Either it's from colleagues or from your supervisor. So we do want people that are fun to work with and that are making the work easier and that do care about us. I say to my students when I teach them that one of the best, well, maybe not best, but one of the fun jobs I've had when I was 15 years old, I was actually washing dishes in a restaurant. Now, that's a pretty tough job. It's dirty, it's messy, you work night shifts, but I had such good friends there, and we had so much fun playing tricks to each other. One time they put some fettuccine sauce in my gloves, my washing gloves, and anyway, so we had a lot of fun, and they actually made my work interesting somehow, even though the actual tasks was pretty boring. So being able to relate to the people at work is an important factor for our social health. So if we put that into an actual model, then you might recognize here this model by Karasek, which has been used for a few decades now, the demand control support model. And all it's saying is that if you have low job control, high job demands, and or low support, then you're more at risk of both psychological and physical health problems, and lower performance in terms of absenteeism, presenteeism at work, and etc. The other model that was used in our study is the Siegrist Model about effort-reward imbalance. What this model says is what I've just mentioned before. In exchange for your effort, in terms of workload that you put in and the responsibilities you have, you're expecting an adequate salary, esteem, respect, promotion, security, so all these rewards. And if you have an imbalance in that, then you are at risk of all kinds of physiological and psychological problems. And this just illustrates this effort-reward imbalance with the coronary heart diseases. And you see that on the right-hand side, the higher the effort, the higher the imbalance, the higher the risk of coronary heart diseases. And the same trend would be found if you were talking about absenteeism, for example. Now, these were the models we were using. Just to say a word about the importance of the manager and the social support we get from our managers. I'm sure if you think about a good job that you've had, generally when you had a good job, you had a good boss. Our boss has a lot of control over our psychosocial constraints. My boss will have some kind of control over my workload, over the social support I get, whether I work in isolation or with a team, and whether I get certain job control. So my boss has a lot to do, but it's also his managing style that will be related to my well-being. And it's not just my well-being, it's also all these indicators like blood pressure, depression, job satisfaction, absenteeism, and productivity. So it's important to have a good manager. Now, these are the 4 psychosocial constraints that I've been using in this research. And just to show you the situation in Quebec in terms of exposure to psychosocial constraint, we've had a study that was conducted by one of my colleagues, Michel Vizina, with over 5,000 workers in Quebec. So this is a representative sample of the Quebec population. You can see that half of the population has low job control and low social support, and 40% or 38 reporting high job demands, and a quarter reporting an imbalance between efforts and reward. So quite a few places where there are problems, and it's not just a situation in Quebec. I don't think we're worse off than anyone else. I think it's pretty much a situation in every industrialized country. And you have here a picture of my supervisor in Lancaster University, Carrie Cooper. And I did my PhD with him, and I really liked working with him. I have a lot of admiration for his work. And he did say something in Rome in 2010 at a conference I attended, and it made a lot of sense to me. He says, we have enough science on what causes people to get ill in the workplace. We know what the problems are. What we need now is to get the solutions. And this has been something that's been puzzling me I've been in this field now for almost 20 years. And we keep talking about what the problems are. We know what the problems are, but we're really struggling to put into place some interventions that are going to be strong and that are going to be lasting in time on a long-term basis, and that'll be generalized to the whole organization, touching everybody. It's been difficult in terms of getting the solutions right. Maria and I just published a book recently called Derailed Organizational Interventions, because we know a lot of these interventions on stress and well-being will fail. So my question at the beginning of this research project is, well, we know that managers play a key role in the implementation of these interventions, but what actually influences managers? What do they need to be implementing interventions? To tell you something about my PhD, the title was Autopsy of a Failure. So I was supposed to follow an intervention, but it actually failed. It just never got implemented for all kinds of reasons. I actually did the autopsy of why it failed. And one of the main reasons was because of managers' ownership. They weren't owning the intervention. They felt that it was just pushed down their throats, and that they were obliged to do this. So they kind of did it, but it was more of a tick the box approach, where they just ticked the box and said, okay, I did my stress risk assessment with my employees, but they didn't necessarily implement subsequent interventions. And my question at the beginning of this actual research project is, what actually influences managers? The other question is, what actually influences the intervention itself, the whole approach? Like, what are the conditions for success? So these are the problems that we're encountering. Now, I'm basically wondering what makes the difference between the planned intervention versus what actually happens in reality. And you have an image here that kind of reflects that. Now, we called this the broccoli project. It had nothing to do with broccoli, but it had to do with that manager who had mentioned that managing psychosocial risks is like broccoli in your plate, as opposed to sugar pie. Now, I did want to have the broccoli title, but the funding body didn't accept. It was the Institute of Research in Occupational Health and Safety in Quebec. And the French report is available on their website, irsst.qc.ca. And the English version is available. It should be just a matter of a few days, like it's... I've seen the actual report, I proofread it, everything is all ready to be published now, so it should be available quite now. The title is rather long because they didn't want me to use the broccoli project as a title, so do not type in broccoli, we'll not find it. But you got my name and the website, you should be able to find it. Now, The participants were 4 organizations in Quebec, 3 of which were actually involved in the certification process called the Healthy Enterprise Standard. You might have heard of that, and I know on the Canadian, there's a lot of people implementing the Canadian standard, but in Quebec, the Quebec standard has been rather popular with our organizations. So we have 3 organizations actually involved in the standard, and another one, a paramedical organization that was not involved in the standard, that was just doing an intervention on psychosocial risks and various psychological health aspects. In order to be included in our study, organization had to have a psychosocial risks assessment that was completed. In other words, we wanted them to have a diagnostic of what happened in their organization. We didn't want to include organizations who were just taking care of, for example, individual aspects such as lifestyle habits and that kind of thing. We wanted to be focused on organizational aspects and on psychosocial risks. So we wanted them to have a risk assessment and to have some interventions either planned or being implemented. Now, just a few words on the standard, if you have not heard of it. It aims to recognize organizational practices that promote a healthy workplace, and it has been based on the Bureau de Normalisation du Québec, and it has like the title Prevention, Promotion, and Organizational Practices for Health in the Workplace. It involves 4 different types of interventions. One is focused on lifestyle habits. The other one is, and that one is actually compulsory, the lifestyle habits. Work-life balance, work environment. So work environment would include, for example, anything to do with ergonomics. If you want people to bike at work, you could have some bike supports outside. You could have some machines distributing healthy food, things like that. That would be in the work environment. And what we were mostly interested in is the management practices. So anything that touches psychosocial risks and how they're managed. That was where our interest was, because we know it's the most difficult. The specific objectives, so we wanted to identify elements first that would facilitate or hinder the adoption of management practices that are fostering good employee mental health. So we're looking at managers, we're interviewing and surveying managers, but we're interested in their practices that they are using with their employees to foster employee mental health. So that's the first condition, what's happening to managers in terms of facilitators and obstacles. The second aspect of this objective is what's actually facilitating or hindering the organizational intervention as a whole, not just the managers. So I have a second objective, but I'll be very brief about it because I didn't talk about it much in this presentation, but it's available in the report. There was an aspect about providing managers with psychosocial risks management tools. So we did give them some tools, a little bit of training, or it was just a one-day training, really. We didn't expect it was going to change their lives, but we did provide some tools and we did take some measures. And we did ask them following that training session to adopt one new practice, something they'd never done before, but that could foster employee psychological health. So I will be showing you the results of that second objective. Now, in terms of research design, objective 1 about identifying, facilitating, and hindering factors for managers' practices and for the interventions. We had 2 waves of questionnaires. So one wave with 144 managers and a second wave 3 months later with 166 managers. And then we had 25 managers and employee representatives who participated to an individual interview. And the second objective was, as I was saying, a management information session on psychosocial constraints. So we met with 73 managers for that second objective. I will spare you of all the methodological details about the characteristics of the participants and the measures and the procedures and all of that. It's all available in the report. Given the short amount of time we have, I wanted to go straight to the findings. So we got 8 findings, and at first I will be talking about management practices, what influenced managers and what are the factors explaining how come some managers are able to adopt management practices that are fostering employee psychological health and others are not? So what are these facilitators? Now, it was an actual questionnaire with 18 items, or 17 items actually, and managers had to indicate the extent to which this corresponded to the usual management practices. So, now, you might be wondering what actually is a healthy management practice. What does that mean? Management practices fostering employee mental health. Well, we used something that was based on an extensive intervention conducted by my colleagues, Maëlle Gilbert-Ouimet and a team of researchers, in a large Quebec organization that was followed over 7 years. The material is published, so you can access it. And they found some significant improvement over 3 waves of questionnaires. And the improvements were observed in terms of decreasing psychological distress, decreasing backache, shoulder and neck pain, decreasing psychological demands, and increases in recognition and social support from colleagues. So you're recognizing here are 4 psychosocial constraints. So there's been some improvement. And when you look at what actually happened, the managers of each of these units that were participating were keeping a logbook in which they registered the interventions that were implemented. And when the researchers analyzed it, they found 17 or 18 items that are fostering health, and in which in the teams that we noticed some improvements. And I gave here some example. I didn't put all 18 items, but I just gave a few examples so you'd have an idea. As you can see, these are pretty much basic management practices. They're rather basic. There's nothing revolutionary in it, but they're kind of the ABC of management. For example, creating committees, workshop, team meetings. Now, in some of our organizations, we might have too many of those and we might complain that we got too many meetings. But in other organizations, regularly, I see people who are just unable to meet. For example, in a hospital last week, someone was telling me they're unable to meet because there's so many shifts, like night shifts and day shifts and all, and it's difficult to get people together. Lack of time, difficult to have the proximity between the manager and the employees. Some of them will have 500 or 600 employees, in which it's impossible to have this proximity that you need. Now, when we talk about, for example, social support, improving social support, well, having committees and team meetings might be a good opportunity to reduce that risk. Same with recognition, providing some recognition, esteem, for our colleagues and for our managers. It might be done through a team meeting, for example. A second example, introducing new work tools to facilitate the task, or implementing organizational changes gradually. Meeting with individuals to adjust their workload, for example, and discussing difficulties. We just recently published a paper on the actual active ingredients of interventions, and this item number 4, meeting with individual, was one of the most important. Simply meeting as a manager with my one-to-one basis with my employees to check what's going on and if there's anything that can be adjusted. Now, it's not always possible as a manager. If you've got like 500 or 600 employees, it might not be possible, but there are different aspects that are not necessarily very flamboyant as an intervention. We don't even see them as an intervention. We see them as day-to-day business, but I think they do have an effect on psychosocial constraints, and it's quite important to focus on that. Adding staff, well, that's always it's not always possible either, but it was one of the good practices that was raised in the study by Gilbert-Ouimet and colleagues. Flexible schedules, enriching tasks in order to promote people's development and ensuring they've got some kind of versatility in their work. So you've got some ideas here of healthy management practices, and what we're asking here with the questionnaires is, what are the conditions explaining why some managers are able to adopt these management practices? And one of the first findings we have in this study is managers who do adopt some healthy management practices, some management practices that are fostering employees' mental health, these managers actually perceived a strong psychosocial safety climate at time 1, so at the first questionnaire. So at the first questionnaire, they got a strong social safety climate. And at the second questionnaire, we noticed that they're adopting more healthy management practices. You might be wondering, what is a psychosocial safety climate? Here's the actual explanation. The definition is from Maureen Dollard, who's the Australian researcher who's actually developed this construct, and I've been using it more and more in my research. It refers to the shared perceptions we have in our organizations regarding the policies, practices, and procedures for the protection of workers' psychological health and safety. So it means in terms of values as an organization, we have a balance between the productivity and the worker health. It does relate to the previous work we had in the 80s on safety climate. You might have heard of that. Safety climate in the 80s was an important aspect to explain safety performance in organization. So in an organization where, for example, you'll have low accidents and people wearing their equipment, their protection equipments and stuff, well, it's an organization where it's a shared perception. Everybody knows that safety is important. It starts from top management, but it goes all the way through all the hierarchical levels. And managers also know that it's important, and they'll transmit it and they'll insist on it. And then it goes to the regulation of teams, where teams will auto-regulate themselves, and they'll tell their colleague, this is not a safety behavior. You shouldn't be working like that. This is not how we do things. Now, what Maureen Dollard has done is applied this idea of safety climate, but at the level of psychosocial issues. Now, what does it actually imply, psychosocial safety climate? We know it's important for managers in order for them to adopt healthy management practices, but what does it actually mean? Well, first it means that they perceive management is committed. I gave you an example of an item of how we actually measure it. So senior management shows support for stress prevention through involvement and commitment. So they feel there's a strong support from top management regarding stress prevention. The second aspect of psychosocial safety climate is priority. So management, senior management, considers employees' psychological health to be as important as productivity. A third aspect is communication. Information about workplace well-being, psychological well-being is always brought to my attention by my manager or my supervisor. So we do communicate. We've got means to talk about these issues in our organization. And the fourth aspect is participation and involvement. The item here is participation and consultation in psychological health and safety occurs with employees' union and health and safety representatives. So everybody is involved and can participate in psychological health and safety issues. Now, if you don't have this in your organization, if you don't have a strong psychosocial safety climate, this might be where your intervention actually starts. It might be the target of your organization. What Maureen Dollard calls it is the cause of causes. If you've got a strong climate, what we see, if you got less risk, I think it was 16% less risk of depression that she measured in one of her studies. And it's a very strong indicator whether your intervention is actually going to be successful. She has shown that more interventions are implemented when the psychosocial safety climate is strong. And in another study that I'm just about to publish, I've also shown that it explained why more intervention are implemented regarding management practices. Now, in this study that we're talking about right now, the Broccoli Project, well, psychosocial safety climate explained why managers were more able to adopt some healthy management practices. So that's the first finding. The second finding was that managers who adopted more healthy practices had a greater job control at time one. I have a little citation here from a manager. He says, "I cannot do it. I'm overloaded with work. I'm asked more and more, and I'm more and more accountable. I am asked for things more and more unfeasible. My budget is cut. My workforce is cut. There are more and more cuts to come. We have had a 3.5 budget cut per year for already a few years. Now, cut here and cut there. There are sectors where the work drags on because we don't have enough staff." So you can see his hands are tied here. might want to be adopting different practices and different ways of managing people, but he's just unable to do it because of budget cuts. And here's another example of managers' lack of control. Now, regarding the management of psychosocial constraints and the healthy enterprise standards, he says that's the hardest part because, how would I say, I find it difficult to make it concrete collectively. When someone enters my office and I see they're not feeling well, I listen, I open the door to chat, I can refer them to the employee assistance program if needed. This is the part I can control. But collectively, we're not there yet. We're unable to manage psychosocial constraints. It's the sphere that has been the most neglected at the moment. The other two findings within this first part that we measured with the questionnaires, managers who were more able to adopt management practices that were fostering mental health, they reported less psychological distress at time one. That means as a manager, you're unable to offer what you don't have. You can't be promoting employees' mental health if you're yourself struggling with psychological distress and with your own psychological issues. It means you need to be strong. Last week I was teaching to a group of managers, and some of them were telling me they're working like 60 hours a week, and then they come home, they feed the kids, and then they go back to work some more to finish some emails. And I was telling them, well, you can't give what you don't have. You got to take care. If you want, you're doing that because you don't want to let your team down, but you can't do it if you're not yourself in a good shape. It's your responsibility as a manager to first have some concern for your own psychological health. So if you've got to, and it's also the responsibility in the organization to take care of our managers. We keep saying managers are important, and we keep saying that they're important for their employees' mental health, but we don't have that many concern or interventions that are specifically targeting managers' distress. And I think this is one of the important findings of this broccoli project. It's saying that in order to adopt some healthy practices that will be fostering employees' health, managers first need to be themselves in a good mental health. And the last finding is that they have, the ones who were adopting more healthy practices had better relations with their subordinates at time one. And what this last finding here tells me is that it relates to another study that was published a few years ago. It's like a chicken or egg situation, because as we know that a supportive supervisor will positively influence the well-being of his employees. What we also know is that employees who feel well, they influence the management style of their superior. Now, if you feel well, your manager is going to be more supportive towards you. And now this is the same with the managers here who report being more supportive when their team is actually feeling well. So it's a chicken or egg situation. I mean, if you're managing a team that's difficult and conflictual, then you might not feel so inclined to change some of your practices or to try something different, or so it might be more difficult for you. Now you got here the psychosocial constraints that were measured, and you just see on a graph what influenced the adoption of healthy management practices. So as we just mentioned, the job control and the relationship with subordinates were the most important factors. They were significant factors influencing management practices. Now what this tells me is it might be some kind of a domino effect where good management practices, if you start on the right-hand side here, good management practices that are fostering employees' mental health will depend on the manager's own mental health, which will then depend on a positive psychosocial environment for the manager, which is then dependent on a strong psychosocial safety climate. So it seems to be going from the top, but going all the way down to employees' mental health. This might be a logical chain of events. Finding number 2 in this study, what works, or what works is not necessarily what is visible in terms of interventions. What I mean by that is interventions on management practices can have a great impact on mental health, but they're not necessarily seen as an intervention. And I'll explain here what I mean. I did ask managers, both through the interviews and the questionnaires, what are the interventions implemented in your organization? If you have a look at the actual responses we've had here, there are very visible activities. They've got this visibility about them. If you look on the right-hand side with the interviews, we're talking about recognition activities, sport and cultural things, a training room, conferences about different teams, the bulletin board, what is visible, distribution of healthy food, etc. Same thing on the questionnaire side. People will mention any activities related to the implementation of the standard. But when they talk about the standard, they're mostly talking about its visual aspect, anything that you can see. I found it quite surprising that the managers I'm asking this question are actually sitting in the room with me. I'm giving them a training session on interventions, and 13 of them answer that no intervention is being implemented in their organization, which is quite surprising because I'm there given the fact that there is an intervention. But they couldn't answer anything. So that tells me there's something that's not very visible in terms of management practices. There's a lot of things in one of these organizations. There was a big leadership program that was being implemented, and I'm sure that it was pretty solid stuff, but it wasn't seen as an actual intervention. So I guess when we're talking about intervention, we're all, often looking for what's going to have this flamboyant or visible character, but it doesn't mean this is what's going to have the most impact. I think what's going to target the psychosocial risks is going to be largely the management practices, and doesn't have necessarily the flamboyant character necessarily. It's more day-to-day business. Another finding, and here I'm I'm entering this idea of the Martini glass we've seen in the beginning of this presentation in terms of context. What was important in terms of context? Well, one of the facilitating factor that was the most reported by participants, and this is not new nor specific to this study, it's been reported in many studies, you need a strong management commitment. Also, a facilitating factor was to promote the intervention at each step and integrate it into strategic planning. It was mentioned as a facilitating factor, where in terms of a hindering factor, some people mentioned strained labor-employer relations, the complexity of the intervention, and the lack of proximity of workers. An example of the management commitment as a specific factor that was reported quite frequently. Someone said the commitment of the board of directors helped immensely to integrate and to sell these interventions, make them interesting and alive. This commitment helps people feel that this is something the employer wants to invest in and not just something they're doing because it looks good. So the importance of management commitment. Another finding was you need strong support for the intervention. We're now here talking about the process, the actual process of how we do the intervention. And people mentioned the importance of having strong opinion leaders, whether they're employees or managers, having some human and financial resources. This might seem like basic components of an intervention, might seem obvious to you, but I have seen quite a few interventions where people will put most of their resources or their efforts in the risk assessment phase, trying to find out and do a diagnostic of what's going on and how much psychological distress we've got and what are the causes of this distress. But then they got nothing left for the implementation phase. This implementation phase will cost some resources. You will need to free people up to participate either in a committee, to analyze, to build up an action plan, and then to implement it. So we do need human and financial resources. Also need some internal and external expertise, depending on what solutions are going to be retained. In one of the projects that was I was involved in, one of the action that was decided upon was to hire an external consultant, and he was available for telephone coaching with the managers. So depending on what problem they had, they could actually get some help specifically for their problem. So that's what I mean by external expertise. But you might also have this expertise internally. In that same project, they also had a board of directors, like all managers were involved in that little committee. And they would talk about managing people and what are the difficulties they have, and is there something in terms of HR issues that we need information on? For example, in one team, the manager would allow flexible schedule, the other one wouldn't. Now, what does the collective agreement say about that? How do we apply it? What's the word of order for every manager? You know, so some internal expertise might be there. Another two important aspects in terms of the process is a person in charge of the intervention. So you will need an intervention champion and also a steering committee. And it is helpful when there are various members from different job groups in that committee. An example of this intervention process and its importance, people say there are several actors, so it drives us to action too. The participation of people is reflected in the choices of interventions that will be made. So we do the analysis together, we choose the intervention, and everyone will get involved. Everything is not just on the shoulders of the HR director, but rather in this case on the committee. A fifth finding of this study was the actual content of the intervention. So we're still in the Martini Glass about the content. We've done the process, the context, and now about the content. The implementation of the planned actions ran into several hindering factors, mainly concerning the relevance of the activities and the manager's lack of tools for taking preventive action. In terms of the relevance, I gave you an example here. There was a manager saying, there's a recognition program for good efforts. I meet with my coordinators. You know, there's a time of the year when we do that. I ask if they have people, names of people they'd like to submit, like we did such and such project. But the answer I get is no, nobody's interested in that stuff. It'll just be a waste of time. So maybe the program is poorly adapted, or maybe they're expressing something that doesn't represent what people feel. I don't know. So the relevance of activities isn't always there. And another example regarding the managers lacking tools for the intervention. One manager is saying, I think that these things stall because managers don't know where to begin, and the committees don't know exactly what to work on. They lack ideas about what exactly to work on and how to go about it. I think it's really a question of ignorance. Even we talk a lot about recognition and a lot for a long time in our company, but that's about the only management practice they've talked about up until now. Now, you have here a sort of summary of the last findings I've been presenting based on the 22 interviews with people who were involved in the organizations. Now you got the context about the top management commitment. On the left side, you got the enabling factors with the number. Under the end there, you got the number of people who've talked about it and what percentage that represents. And then the other column, you've got the percentage of obstructing factors, people mentioning it as an obstructing factor. So just to give you an example, in terms of top management commitment, 13 people mentioned it as an enabling factor. And 2 people mentioned it was an obstructing factor in the sense that top management commitment was not there or was not sufficient. So in total, you got 15 people who mentioned top management commitment as an important issue, 13 as a positive thing, 2 as a negative thing. Same thing with the intervention process, the importance of line managers and employees' commitment and the availability of resources. And at the end, the lack of relevance and lack of tools to enable your managers to take action. So it's a summary of the actual analysis in our interviews. I'm almost in my last findings now. So finding 6 was about the manager's needs. We did ask them in the questionnaire, what are your needs in terms of management practices that are fostering employee psychological health? And the most frequently cited needs were coaching and training on psychosocial risks and mental health issues, social support, for example, via a co-development program or manager's assistance program, as an opposition to employee assistance program, was something related to work and to managers' work, access to human resources to implement interventions, And I did put a little table here. You got the actual numbers in the questionnaire and the question that was asking them. So what might help you to adopt management practices that foster people's health? And these were identified by managers who completed at least one of the two questionnaires. So 192 managers, and you got the numbers here in terms of what they wanted. So 112 that are mentioning some training in terms of psychosocial risks or mental health issues. So there is some relevance to this idea of training managers in as an intervention itself, and there is some literature to support that as well. There's some scientific evidence behind this idea of training managers as an intervention to improve employee well-being. Finding number 7, now this is objective number 2, which I didn't talk about. I did mention at the beginning that we trained managers. It was a short one-day information session. We did ask them at the end of the session, we gave them the questionnaire to complete, and then we asked them at the end of the day, after presenting all the 4 social constraints and some ideas of management practices to address each of these constraints, we did ask them, over the next 3 months, try to adopt 1 or 2 different practices, try to do something different, just try and risk it. And following that session, when we measured them 3 months later, we had 63% of managers who adopted a new practice. And in 64% of the time, these practices pertain to communication, training, or recognition. And I did put the table here so you could see what type of practices that they tried to implement. So you see in the middle bit here that management practices fostering communication, training, and recognition, that was mentioned by 64% of my sample. Could be an activity on recognition, a one-to-one meeting with employees, or took the time to socialize and be a good listener, said hello, took the time to listen and smile at a minimum of 1 person a day. So smiling as an intervention. Well, there you go. But the interesting thing is 34% encountered a problem in implementing this new practice. Yeah, it is difficult to smile some days, you know. But then again, there was other types of intervention. Maybe just coming back here at the lower part, management practices concerning the technical organization of work. So you see offering flexibility in the work schedule, modifying a workstation, revising the workload. So you see, it's not just activities about smiling. Okay, so 34.5% who encountered a problem in implementing this new practice, but 86% who noted positive impacts on their team. And you here have the problems that were encountered. So their team having difficulty accepting the change, a team being impatient, not agreeing with the proposed change, difficult to implement on a daily basis, people not participating, lack of time, difficult to talk about it. But perceived effects on employees, positive effect in 86% of the time. So it was appreciated by most, fewer conflicts, better atmosphere, employees less stressed, less frustrated, etc. More commitment, greater efforts to achieve management's objectives. So I thought that was quite interesting. It is important to mention that 10% or 11% had negative impact. So, for example, people not taking ownership or blaming others for problems or increased negativity. So there's a small risk that things might not improve for the best. But in most of the time, and again, this is supported by a review that was done by a researcher, most interventions generally will have positive effects. Sometimes they'll have no effect, but it's quite rare that we'll see negative effects. So this is just their perceptions, but when we actually measure things, it's quite rare that we find a negative effect of interventions. Now, my conclusions, I got 3 of them. I think one of the essential factors in interventions is the psychosocial safety climate. Remember, it's about commitment, and management priority for psychological health. And it's about offering means for communication and participation. And to me, this is an essential factor. There's studies showing that it will influence the success of the implementation of interventions. In this study, we're showing it influences managers' adoption of practices. that can foster health. And there's more and more science behind this psychosocial safety climate. Another conclusion I'd like you to remember is this idea of a domino effect. Managers are influenced by their own organizational and psychosocial context and by their own psychological health, and they could and should be the target of our interventions. These seems to be, they are sometimes forgotten. We think of them as providing employee with well-being or influencing employees' well-being, but not so often as to themselves being employees who might have some distress and who might need help. And the third conclusion is about ensuring the quality of the implementation process. As I mentioned, there's a lot of effort being put into risks assessment and having a very adequate and precise risk assessment. And we often forget that the implementation process is going to take some effort and resources to be to support both the managers and the intervention. Perhaps one quick word about the contribution of the study. What was the study for? What did it bring in terms of knowledge? Well, interventions are often studied as a black box. And what I mean by that is we measure people before and after, and then we say it either worked or it didn't work. But we don't have any information about what happened in between those two measures. And this study opens up the black box of interventions and their implementation. Because we see how interventions can be implemented through managers' action. One of the limitations of the study was, I think it was the context of 3 out of 4 organizations that were focused on implementing the Healthy Enterprise Standard. And not that it's a limit in itself. I think what was a limit is that most of them were focused on lifestyle habits, and the management practices and the psychosocial risks was one of the weak spots, and that kind of limited the scope of interventions that we were able to look at. So I kind of see that as a limit, because in other organizations where we would be more focused on, for example, specifically improving management practices for psychosocial constraints, that we might have had like a wider scope and a wider range of perceptions on this. Now, one last word for the end. I think psychological health at work is a shared responsibility. We do tend to put in our organizations the responsibility on workers. We'll have a lot of conferences on you be healthy and make sure you relax and you take care of your own health. And I think this is good, but I think we also need to look at what we can do as a team and how management can have an influence and how we can support teams and managers, and also at corporate social responsibility. I think psychosocial safety climate is an issue of governance and corporate social responsibility, and we do need to question these in our organizations. And thank you very much for your attention today. And I think I do have a little bit of time for some questions or some comments.
Great. To our audience, if you have any questions at this time, please enter them into the question box in the GoToWebinar panel. One of the questions that came in, how can HR work together with department managers to increase employee well-being?
That's a good question. I think at first, depending on the configuration of your organization and of the intervention, the roles will have to be clarified. I did an intervention that was quite complex, and there were external consultants that were involved, HR were involved, managers, and then it can get quite confusing, and it can be a source of conflict as to who's responsible for what. So it needs to be defined in specifically in your organization and your intervention. But I think there are a lot of daily HR practices that can integrate this idea of psychological health through, for example, recruiting managers with some people skills, training managers in order for them to improve their skills at managing people, in terms of just training and managing, supporting them, for example, in the implementation of some practices to foster health, or in the implementation of specific interventions. I did mention this idea of a board of directors where issues of people management are discussed. And at the committee where I was sitting, there were pretty much every week or every meeting, they were inviting somebody from HR to clarify different things with which they struggle on a daily basis in their management practices. And to me, this is managing stress at its source. It's primary prevention, because you're preventing conflicts and you're preventing things from deteriorating. You're trying to stop stress right at its source by managing constraints. And HR does have a role in various ways on this aspect.
Okay. Is there one particular intervention that stands out as having positive effects?
There is no magic bullet, no special recipe. In the Capturing Active Ingredients of Interventions that we just published recently, I did look at various types of interventions to see which ones would have the strongest impact. So some of them were focused on social support, some of them were focused on improving job control, and some of them were more focused on the manager. So I think it will depend on what are the actual needs of the people. It needs to be based on a risk assessment. So there's no one size fits all here. I would say, however, that in my sample, with the 4 organizations that I had in this previous study, the relationship with the manager was something important. We like to say sometimes with my colleague that mental health is something that happens with around 5 meters around you. Okay, so if you have to choose an intervention, it'll be something that affects people 5 meters around them. So that means their colleagues, their managers, and try to affect 2,000 hours. We work in average 2,000 hours a year. Now, if you're inviting someone to give a conference on whatever subject, they'll be there for 1 hour. It's not going to change their lives. You're sending them for a one-day training. Well, it's a one day. How about affecting the 2,000 hours? And this is where I think managers have an important role. They are working with people on a daily basis. So if you can manage to help managers and support their practices and help them adopting some good and healthy management styles, then you will be influencing the 2,000 hours that people work. So it's not a magic bullet, not one intervention that stands out, but it's something that has science behind the fact that it might work.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. In the psychosocial safety climate slides, was there one aspect that might be weighted as more important than the other, or do all aspects need to be positive to make a difference?
That's an interesting question. I don't think that so far we've been using the specific dimensions of psychosocial safety climate. I would think, based on my experience, that management commitment would be the most important. But I don't. There's various studies. Like one study, for example, showed that when people are actually involved in the intervention, when they're involved in designing the intervention, they are getting more benefits from it. So do not hesitate to get involved in your health committee in your organization. You might get some positive effects from it. But in terms of studies showing specific dimensions, specific facet of the psychosocial safety climate, it's not been studied this way. It's been studied as a 12 questions, and we've used it as a one dimension, but it's definitely something we should be looking at in the future.
Okay, and I think that concludes our Q&A session for this presentation. Dr. Biron, is there something that you would like to add?
I just want to thank everybody for taking the time on your busy schedule to be here today. It's much appreciated.